Hi, this is A.R.K. Watson with Catholic Reads, and I'm joined today by Annette Young, author of A Distant Prospect and by Violence Unavenged, which was released just this month, right?
Yep, that's right.
Mhm.
Or actually June, it's to be released, yeah, end of May.
Oh, okay. So it's about to be released. By the time you're listening to this, it will have already been released. Um, but anyways, these two novels, they're both historical fiction novels. And they're in the same world, but they're very different. Distant Prospect is set in Australia, and it's sort of a coming of age novel set with children. Specifically, it follows, I cannot say her name. Is it Luxay?
Just use Lushak, but just say Lucy.
Okay, her name is Lushak, or Lucy. She's an Irish immigrant to Australia after World War II. She's recovering from polio.
World War One, yeah.
Or sorry, after World War I, and she was recovering from polio, and she joins a musical quartet and makes friends with these girls and kind of grows up with them. And then in your sequel, I don't know. I didn't read the first one. I read the second one, and I understood it perfectly fine. I need to go back and read it, the first one. It's told from a different perspective, a different point of view, but it's the same quartet. It's Phoebe instead of Luxay.
That's right.
And I know I'm butchering that name. I'm just gonna say Lucy. Yeah, and it's kind of a huge Bildungsroman again, but it goes beyond her childhood into her adulthood and follows her out of Australia and into Austria. Because when she was very young, her mother was murdered, and her father kind of went a little crazy, and her whole family fell apart essentially after that. And so since then, she's had this like thirst for, she says justice, but it's kind of vengeance, one of those things. And she traces her killer back to Europe and also goes to Austria because her father had dual citizenship.
Yeah.
And he was part of like the elite musical culture there and kind of brushed shoulders with a lot of royalty. And she goes and she takes up his old acquaintances and kind of learns about her father, more about her father. And then, you've got World War II just starting to brew up, and these troublesome Nazis bickering in the corner that become a greater and greater threat. So that's a brief summary of the book. If you want to read my full review, or like Esley Hall's full review, it'll be on the website. But what inspired you to write this series and these? Why these settings? And
it's an interesting one. Do you want for both books or the first book or the second book
tell me about the
mainly?
first book first.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's going back quite a long way now because I first wrote Distant Prospect back in 1995, and let's see, and then rewrote it in 12. Oh, was it 2010? Began to rewrite it,
It's a
and
big
yes, a very long boil time, that one. So I'll talk about Prospect first, which was, funnily thing enough, I've always had imaginary friends. Okay, so I've had imaginary characters in my head ever since I was a very small child, and I would often retreat into whatever imaginary world I had created, and that was my solace all the way through school, even into university and post-university. Was this other world that I was sort of almost more comfortable in than the real one. And it really actually got to quite a serious problem that I would prefer the imaginary place to the real place at any time, and was just hungering for that time alone. And I thought, well, look, you're going to have to do something with this. And yes, make something of it. And I never thought I'd ever write fiction, ever. Ever. I was not a big writer at school. I was good at English, but I was lazy as. Didn't bother with it whatsoever. But somehow, by the time I finished my bachelor's at university, I was teaching, which I hated. Um, I had more questions than my students to ask my students, and they wanted to answer. And so I thought I've got to go and do something with that. So I ended up doing a PhD, and I was doing it on Charlotte Bronte. And I happened to be working with a professor who'd done her PhD had been the early writings of Charlotte Bronte, and she had gone travelling all over the world to collect Bronte manuscripts, and I was transcribing them and then analysing them. And I got into this transcribing process as well. And I suddenly realised that she was doing exactly what I was doing. She had invented an imaginary world that she was living. And when I read some of her, there are not many diary entries, but there was this sense of people taking over her head. And not quite a sickness, just a very fertile and incredibly turbulent world sometimes. And I sort of thought, well, she can do it, so can I. At the same time, I was involved in researching a PhD thesis on her novels, and well, what better way to understand a novel than write one yourself? So that's what prompted it. So it was sort of half the psychological need, half a literary exercise to really understand how a novel is put together. I'm a big structure person. I like to know how things work. I suppose it comes from being a musician. You've got to take things apart and work things out. Anyway, and so I started to write very hesitantly at first, and then it just started torrenting out. Torrenting. And this book emerged in the first 6 months of doing my PhD. I'll never forget taking it to show my supervisor. So I've done this. So there wasn't any expose or summary of a doctoral thesis. There was a book. I wasn't terribly good at that point. And anyway, did that, tinkered with it for the next 15 years. And it wasn't until after I married that I sat down and rewrote it. Complete.
Very cool. I love the Charlotte Bronte angle. She's one of my favorites. I have to reread Jane Eyre every year. Have to.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. It's wonderful. Yes. So, she's just the most amazingly passionate, insightful writer. This is marvelous stuff. Anyway, so that was Prospect at the end. So 2011, 2012. Wait a minute, no. I finished it. Yeah, 2012. That's right. And by the time I finished that one, I realised I had 5 books up my sleeve. I knew I could write. And I never thought I'd write any more books after writing Distant Prospect. It was just the sort of the little passionate work that meant so much, etc., and a book that changed my life actually. But then anyway, people started enjoying it, so I'll write another one, and so started writing By Violence Unavenged, which has morphed into a trilogy. So that's another story altogether. And this is this has been quite a different right to Prospect. Prospect in a sense was my what you call juvenilia, your work of childhood that sort of come into fruition during adulthood, but it's based a lot on not so much childhood experience, but the childhood world, the childhood imaginary world. Whereas By Violence Unavenged, I think I would have to say it's a much more calculated piece, much more deliberate, much more it's you know what the tools are, and you sort of a far more different work in that, but still the same imaginative indulgence. I do live in a world of imaginary characters.
So why the World War I and II setting?
I've always loved the 1920s. I was very attached to my grandmother as a child, and that was her era. So there was just a natural affiliation for that. And so that's why the novels were set, that the first novel was set back then mainly. And it grew from there actually, because well, I've always had a historical interest in stuff. History is my best subject at school. I've always, kept on, did it at university, majored in it at bachelor level. My PhD had an historical bent to it, supporting the literary analysis. So there's always been that interest in history. I personally love that interwar era, and it actually was interesting in its own right because I had to investigate quite seriously about World War One and so forth, and so started doing that. And as you do when you're a writer, because you have to know as much as you can about whatever it is to be able to bring to your characters what you need to bring to them. And I actually didn't know anything terribly much about the 1930s when I began by Violence Unavenged, and it sort of stemmed from having built the world of A Distant Prospect and the obligation to continue that world. And so it resulted in a whole lot of new reading, and it became just quite a very interesting investigation. And I mean, I love it now. I'm fascinated by it. But it was not an era that I was really familiar with. I mean, I was mainly a medieval scholar at Sydney Uni, as well as American and 19th century Australian history. So 20th century history was not my forte whatsoever. And so it was a sort of a new project for me, which was lovely.
Well, I mean, you kind of drew from some of that medieval history, and that it's not set during the Austrian Empire, but the characters that you've built, they talk about it, they idealize it, and I didn't really know much about the Austrian Empire
Yeah.
before reading your book.
Well, I didn't either until I started writing it, but it was it was interesting how that happened, because when I was doing the work for Distant Prospect and developing the adult characters, in particular Phoebe's father Roderick and his milieu, his friends, the Epsteins and so forth. And I had to decide where they had received their musical training. And at the turn of the century, the two main centres for that were Vienna and Paris. And I had not been to Paris, but I had been to Vienna. So I decided to pick Vienna. And with that led to an investigation, well, who would have been Roderick's teacher? And so is an investigation of key violin personalities in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century. And that led me to Arnold Rosé, who's a very interesting character in his own right. And sorry?
Rosé is a historical figure.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yes. He was the first violinist of the Rosé Quartet, which played for more than 50 years together. And various personalities came in and out, but Rosé was first violinist from the beginning. He was also the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic, as it became known. And he and his family are very interesting figures, very prominent figures in Viennese society. And it was a very intriguing. In fact, I don't want to give too much away here. So, but with that came the interest in the Habsburgs, and particularly Blessed Karl von Habsburg, and his position at the end of World War One, and the Austrian situation at the end of World War One. And it was quite fascinating because I've always approached, in school, through university reading and stuff, when you read about the war, you usually read about the war from the British side. And so having to investigate World War One from the other side was really fascinating. And how this would have affected different characters, particularly somebody like Phoebe's father, who was an Australian, had, spent his last years of his youth in Vienna, had loved this place, had fitted into this milieu, and then being, coming back to Australia and then being faced with the cataclysm of World War One and the compromising of loyalties and so forth. What position that put him in, and it just became fascinating. Just a wonderful way to sort of view history from another perspective and to bring all that out. And so,
and I think what I found especially interesting was that a lot of the they're not royalty when Phoebe knows them, right? Because after World War One, the royalty is abolished. So all the ex-counts and dukes and barons are regular, kind of upper middle class folks. But she's talking to them, and they talk about it. They seem to think of their empire as the Holy Roman Empire, and just that Catholic significance of that was very interesting to me.
Well, it had been in place for 700 years. I mean, at least the Habsburgs had a position in Europe since the 13th century. And so there's this enormous tradition of government and the wisdom that brings with it, a sense of family, a sense of history, a sense of duty is incredibly strong. It's ingrained in the psyche, in the culture. So that, and for it to be overturned so quickly through a communist revolution, which effectively what the 1918, 1919 uprisings were, they were driven by, as along with the impact of the war, it's just traumatic, to say the least. And you can't just sweep 700 years of history under the carpet.
Realized how Germany's kind of latching on to this idea of empire and wishing for empire was kind of grew out of that nostalgia for this ancient Catholic empire.
It has very deep roots. I mean, this is back to Charlemagne. This is back to 800 AD. It's long, very deep roots, and Germany's enmity with France has been this. It has existed since the division of the Holy Roman Empire between Charlemagne's sons, if my medieval history serves me correct here. It's it's very deep rooted. The whole concept of the Holy Roman Empire and what that actually what that encapsulated, this unity, sort of, a unity of Christian lords, kings, and their duty to protect their subjects from external hostile influence. At first it was the Moorish influence, but then later on the duty to protect the subjects from internal hostilities, is what arose with Protestantism later. And this is the difficulty with Germany. You had the rise of Prussia in the 17th century, and this very Calvinistic authority coming in and coming to bear upon the other German states, and the unification of Germany stems from that. And it's quite a different idea to the Austrian old Holy Roman Empire, very deeply Catholic Christian, multi-ethnic, and itself had a very, very difficult time coming to terms with the nationalism that was rising in the industrial world that was ensuing, in the 19th century. Anyway, there's an awful lot of history.
It surprised me, but it really charmed me that Phoebe's father, this man who's he's half white, half Chinese, and part Jewish himself, he fits right into this bourgeois Viennese culture, and nobody makes a fuss about it. I mean, you touch on some issues like was it Emil, one of your Jewish characters, had some complaints against the old empire, but it wasn't the stodgy, purely racist, culture that I guess I have kind of been led to assume a lot of past histories are, and that was really encouraging.
Yeah, well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was just enormous in terms of. My younger son has just come in with some new findings. I'll tell you more about that later. But German was the first language out of administrative need. Basically, it was the language of the ruling the government. And sort of like the way French is the language of the Olympic Games. It was the language that was the common.
You need to pick something so that
I've got to pick something. So but it extended as far north as Poland. It extended into Galicia, which is now part of Russia, part of the Ukraine. It extended down to the Baltic states. So you've got Bosnia, can't say it's too early in the morning at the moment. So all the Bulgaria, Romania, down south, Yugoslavia, down as far as the Adriatic Sea. So Croatia, Slovenia, and as well as Hungary and what is now known as modern Austria. And so you have this conglomerate of about 11 languages at least. These very different ethnic. When Bosnia-Herzegovina was attached to Austria at the beginning of the 20th century, it became part of this multinational configuration. It incorporated a number of Muslims. And it was the Habsburg Empire that did give settlement to lots of Jews who were expelled by the Russian Tsars. And so that Pale of settlement, it was known. So around Galicia, parts of the Ukraine, into Poland, had large Jewish populations who were able to live there. It was this umbrella, that gave. Yeah. And it was quite interesting, the governmental policies that were put in place, and specific situations were considered to try and work out what was the best way of providing protection for these people, allowing them to be able to live freely, at the same time maintaining a reasonably functioning state. It's an extraordinary achievement, and I think a lot needs to be looked into that. To see how it worked, because it's incredibly complex. But you have all sorts of particular considerations, like, for instance, Krakow in Poland, which was created as the duchy, because there was it was sort of like a respect for the need for independence, at the same time to have that subsidiarity. With the empire, that there was this contribution, there was protection as well as contribution of raw materials and cultural integration, whole things, but at the same time a reasonable degree of political freedom, and it is very cleverly done, in a very, very humane, very Christian, very charitable way.
Yeah, I noticed. Anyway. Didn't you dedicate By Violence and Unavenged to was it the Last Emperor?
That's right. Blessed Charles.
Why did you do that?
He is such an interesting character. I read Joanna Bogle's book, A Heart for Europe, and she does discuss the Holy Roman Empire extremely well, and the contribution of the Habsburgs to society, really. And what impressed me was the way in which this man, who was never really, he was not directly in line to the Austrian throne. He came there by default following the assassination of the early deaths of earlier heirs, and then the assassination of Franz Ferdinand put him next in line. All of a sudden, he had to come to terms with this machinery of government, and in a situation where there were a lot of things happening that led up to World War One, that was way out of his sort of ability as a young man. He was only in his late 20s when this happened, but having to deal with political, the Poloniuses of of the Austrian and German government. Really shrewd foxes who've been in the job for years, have got their policies, got their worked out how they're handling this, and being completely out of his depth and having to deal with the war. He came to the throne in 1916, and having to work it all out, and then you're completely overridden in the aftermath of Versailles. His desires for a federation of the former empire, so the various what became the little satellite or the little countries of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, so forth, wanting to have a sort of a federation, sort of maintaining the old Christendom that had been his legacy, but it was completely overridden, and you had these small states set up in accordance with some more republican, socialist governments. Yugoslavia was a different case in point, and with the result that it really weakened that entire Middle Europe structure, which laid her open to Nazism and then to communism, and it's just been played out for the rest of the century. But he's an interesting figure. He's very much overridden, dismissed by historians, but he's a wonderful, wonderful man. Anyway, so he's my patron saint of difficult things.
One of your characters mentioned that he was up for sainthood. Was he confirmed as a saint?
He's a blessed.
Oh, he's blessed.
So that's why I've called him a truly blessed friend in the dedication. Mm-hmm. He is the blessed, and a blessed, I think, 2013.
Wow.
Very recent, yeah.
It's pretty cool.
It's beautiful.
So moving from your grand sweeping historical overarching thing, I want to go into the characters. So obviously from the title, I think a lot of people can pick up that vengeance and justice are big themes in By Violence Unavenged. Yeah. And I think especially in like Phoebe and her two love interests, Karem and Hubby.
Hubie.
Hubie, is that how you say it?
Yes, short for Hubert.
Okay, Hubie and Emile too. Phoebe's obviously she's on her own path for vengeance, and I feel like she wants to find love. Like she almost gets married at one point, but she keeps getting distracted by this this manhunt she's on. And then you have Karem too, who's this Turkish man, kind of a nominal Muslim who's has like a criminal past and was punished for it. So he's got like a different perspective on. Like, he's moved on and is clearly very nice and respectful, and probably the kindest person to her. And then you've got Hubie, who Hubie's a very interesting character. What did you have in mind when you were writing him?
Let's see. Each of the characters in the book, have to say, do represent a different aspect of the whole political situation. So he really had to encapsulate that Habsburg legacy. He's the character along with his mother, and so there were all sorts of things that went into that. When you're writing a character, the name is incredibly important. It's sort of a birthing of the character when you actually pin a name on them. And so Hubi is short for Hubert, and Saint Hubert is the patron saint of hunters, in particular. And he's Schutz von Rechtschaffen, which is Schutz is a hunter, and protector. Von Rechtschaffen is of righteousness.
Mm.
So he is a seeker. He is one who seeks after righteousness. A man very serious about his social obligations, about his position in the world, about his duties to God and others. This is Hubi, but at the same time, compromised by his circumstances, because he's no longer in the position that was his inheritance as a baron. He is no longer able to fulfill those traditional obligations, and in a sense, is also running away from them, because he has had his fingers burnt by the circumstances. And I don't want to give too much away. And has his own. Well, he has his own path to come to terms with. And
Yeah.
I think also
When you have the Nazis invade, that's, I think, a big moment for him, where that's the ultimate, like, I wasn't able to protect my country kind of
yes,
for him.
yes, and I think one of the themes in the book is what do you do when circumstances are beyond your control, either because of the circumstances themselves or because you as a person are so ill-equipped to have any effect on them. You mentioned the whole thing of Phoebe with this tension between love and justice. I sort of joke privately with myself, she's a bit of an Ado Annie, in that sense that, she looked at an Ado Annie from Oklahoma. She just looks at a man and falls in love with him. I just can't help it,
Like
She's not quite like that, but there's that element in it. She's just a very sensual, very emotionally driven person, a very emotionally needy person, who would much prefer to love than not. It's natural to all of us, but I think in particular it's particularly intense for Phoebe.
Yeah. I think anyone whose family life has been disrupted as a child, that's a kind of a natural response.
Yeah, it's this craving for love, which is just so against what she perceives as her duty toward, for justice, as she would describe it. And she's a very tender person. She's a very vulnerable, compassionate person. She's naturally compassionate, and yet she's putting herself in a position where she must be most uncompassionate. How do you deal with that? And then Hubi with his he stutters. He's got a law degree, but he feels ill-equipped to, for various reasons. He's shied away from doing that. He hides as a musician. He's in a quandary as to how to fulfill those social obligations. He's young. He's only in his mid-20s.
Yeah, but he's at times very weak. His asthma was a little scary.
Yeah. There's that element as well. So how does he go about doing what he feels he needs to do, or thinks he needs to do? And faced with a situation, particularly with the Anschluss and the impact of Nazi law and so forth, how do you deal with that? It's this tidal wave of violence, of policy, of incredibly well organized. Well, not quite well organised, but incredibly powerful political engine.
I think you can call the Nazis well organized.
They were in some ways, and the other ways they were incredibly opportunistic.
Yeah.
It's a very curious mixture. I suppose it's sort of like a chess game where you've got a plan, but then you you have to change things in the course of the game, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about Emil? Can you talk a little bit about what inspired him?
Oh gosh.
Emil, for readers who don't know, he is a Jewish person living in Vienna. He runs a bookshop. He's like
He's a communist.
Yeah, he's a communist. He kind of made me think of this kid I knew in college who always walked around with like a military trench coat on and the Communist Manifesto, which in his pocket, which symbolically was confusing for me because it was an American military jacket. But yeah, he's this kind of firebrand kind of guy. And he's in love with Hubie's sister, but is not allowed to marry her because he is Jewish and not Christian, and he's communist.
He's Jewish by circumstance of birth, and this is the interesting thing about Judaism. I'll talk about that later. But Emil would never call himself. He'd say he was.
He's more
Jewish by race rather than by religion.
Yeah.
And his communism is an interesting situation. He's very compromised. The interesting thing with communism in Vienna in particular was that I think they really took Trotsky's ideas to heart. I don't know whether you've read Animal Farm, but the whole small collective, where everybody working together, this rule of the proletariat was taken really seriously, and it's actually quite effectively implemented. But it was quite different from the Stalinist communism that emerged later on. So the Viennese had achieved their revolution in 1919. They were building their society and changing all the housing and getting everything right. And then watching at the same time the rise of Stalin through the 20s, and then the exile of Trotsky in 1926, 27, and looking on in absolute horror as to the way this thing was going. So Emil's in this position where he was an adolescent when the end of the war, had joined the communist cause. That's fueled his youth, all these very strong communist socialist ideas. He's been part of an establishment of this new society in the early 20s, when he himself is in his early 20s. And then he watches what is happening with, Mother Russia and the rise of Stalin, and he's horrified. And this, so there's this questioning of the ideals and their practice. And so when Phoebe meets him in the mid-30s, he's not quite sure where he stands. He's seeing his world fall apart, and it's with also what's happened in Austria as a result, with the fall of the socialists at the end of the 20s and the rise of the Christian People Party, now with Dollfuss and then later Schuschnigg. This is another very interesting example of sort of a more Christian socialism, and trying to bring the principles of Rerum Novarum and Christian social teaching to a republican state, which is what they wrongly called the Austro-fascists tried to do in the early 30s, and then having to deal with a very difficult society with the Nazi murmurings, the communist murmurings, the socialist murmurings, and then having to clamp down on it completely because of the threats coming from all angles. And Emil's has seen his world come apart, and he really is looking for a way out of this, a solution for this when Phoebe meets him. So having him represent, as he does, the Austro-communist position, which is an interesting one in itself, and then developing into a character of, and how he faces what. But anyway, that's how Emil sort of came about. When I do characters, I often like to sort of create memes that, how I see myself, how such and such a character sees me, how this character sees me, how the other, all the other characters in the book see me. And I'll often use art to do it, the key pictures, paintings and things come to mind. So with Emil, how he sees himself is very much the Leonardo da Vinci ideal man, the one with the... and being an architect by profession, that's a sense of proportion and rightness. I mean, yet he's, you know, he's ugly, he's deformed, he's that's how he sees himself. That's it.
Where's the picture of Hubie?
On my Facebook. Benny drew a picture of Hubie, you see, so it's on my
It's
Facebook.
very good.
And
Cool.
it's actually very accurate. And let's see. Okay. And then how Hubie sees Emil is there's a detail in Michelangelo's Last Judgment of the one of the devils in the boat, rowing the boat across into the underworld. It's this really deformed black figure. Anyway, that's how Hubie sees Emil. Hubie's brother Franz sees Emil as sort of like liberty leading the people. You know, it's that classic mid-century French revolutionary type figures. I have all these pictures in my mind when I'm doing it. You know, Phoebe sees him as Caliban and has made reference, a few Caliban references from The Tempest when she describes him. So there are all those sorts of elements in it. I just have fun with myself when I'm doing that with literary references, when I'm creating a character.
That's a really neat idea.
You know.
What about Karim? What inspired you with his character? I like him. I don't know where you're taking his character. Like Hubie, I can see his arc kind of moving towards humility, and he's probably going to get himself into trouble and some political intrigue, and he might turn into Emil or something. I don't know. And then Emil is kind of doing like, I feel like Hubie's going this way, and Emil's going like this way. But Karim he seems very steady, and yeah.
Well, this is a man with a past, and he's, you know, are coming to terms with a past and a desperatness to make to really fully come out of it. I'll talk about the theme of, you know, of mercy later on. And it was sort of like, from a pragmatic point of view, I needed a character that Phoebe would meet en route to Vienna. And it was interesting, you know, what route she would have taken to Vienna. We decided to go via Constantinople and come across that way through. And so having sort of a Turkish element was quite fascinating. And then, well, what sort of, you know, if she's meeting a character in there, what sort of character would he be? And so Turkey, it resulted in a bit of an investigation of Turkey at the time. And we watched the entire Kurt Sayate Sura that came out on Netflix, binge watched. It was a Turkish production. It was a Turkish production of, it is a novel. It's about, it was a three series thing, as there were about 20 episodes, I think, and it's about a Turkish officer in the Imperial Russian Army at the time of the First World War who falls in love with a Russian aristocrat, and it's their very tumultuous relationship throughout the course of World War One, the Communist Revolution, and then Turkey at the end of the war, and then the rise of modern Turkey. And it was fascinating. We were glued to it. Not going to bed till 2 o'clock in the morning and everything. Anyway, so Karem sort of had to be a character that sort of blended in with all this. And as far as the themes of justice and mercy are concerned, the fact of, you know, his past and a man coming to terms with his past, a man for whom justice has been very severely inflicted, and with huge ramifications on his psyche. And so having him come in with Phoebe, who is, you know, pursuing this sort of path of vengeance, you know, it's just an interesting cultural as well as moral conflict. And, and then see, where am I going with this? And having him as an older man was another interesting point because of Phoebe's relationship with her father and with other men. So she gets on very well with older men. She is comfortable with older men, and having this older figure. It was this father, a substitute father figure in many ways, but it has other dimensions to it. And it was just he was not quite an afterthought, but he was tricky to get right, first of all, to get incorporate into the story. But then once he came in, it did become a very interesting thread to follow through. And anyway, I don't know whether I answered your question properly.
No, it's all right. It's hard because so this is the first of a trilogy, right? So a lot of stuff you haven't even really gotten into yet. The book ends shortly. I'm not spoiling it. It's in history. It ends shortly after the Nazis have taken over Austria, but before they've really started invading the rest of Europe. So I know there's a lot left to get through that they've got to survive and deal with.
Yeah. I think, look, in relation to Karem, look, one of the themes of the book is to do with salvation, and it is to do with a comment that Phoebe's father says to her: "There is nothing that happens to us that is not intended for our salvation," and that everyone is in need of salvation, and Karem himself is looking for, just in the way that Emil is looking for it without even realizing it, is looking for a way through. And Phoebe, and it's the effect that we have on each other through the communion of saints, that is a path that is towards salvation, that we all have a hand to play in each other's salvation. And it's the effect of Phoebe on Corinne, the nature of their meeting, and what the two of them talk about, how she treats him is incredibly important for him and for her throughout the books. So there's probably a better answer.
Yeah, it's good. So I don't really have any other specific questions. I really enjoyed the different things, like how everyone is absolutely convinced that war is not going to happen. Why would we ever go to war? We just got out of one.
Yeah, nobody wanted a war. In fact, that's, it's probably, the Second World War is probably a war that should have been fought in the early 30s, 1933, 34, 35, but couldn't be fought because of the lack of resources and the depression. But and this, we're not going to have a war, so we're going to get rid of all our arms, which is what Britain did in particular. France was France did not do, with the result that they just didn't have the means to be able to do it. And secondly, the devastating effects of the First World War. Nobody wanted another war. The last thing you want to do, which is a misapplication of justice as well, was a false mercy to delay when things were crying out for resolution.
Yeah, it was something that Hubie says to Phoebe, is kind of towards the end. He says, "Why are you wasting your time trying to smuggle Jews out of Austria? That's not going to fix the problem." Like, oh man, there's so many people that, I fall into that trap too, thinking, being kind to my neighbor and providing the little mercies I can, that's not going to fix the big problems of society. So why bother worry about it?
Yeah, well, they work together, but one cannot detract from the other, and it's a difficult balance to.
Yeah, and looking back, hindsight, we know that that's all they could do. That they were going to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah. Of course, it creates an interesting point in this as well. I do get this onto this in the second book, is because being a Turk, he had experiences of the Armenian genocide.
Oh.
So when he finds Jews coming on his doorstep selling their jewellery in February 1938, he thinks, what is going on here? Immediately, because he sees the fear. He's seen that sort of fear before.
Oh, man. I didn't think about that.
Well, that's what prompts him to react to it and take such action, because he's encountered this before. Whereas other people in European countries have not encountered this sort of systematic persecution to the same degree and intensity, both geographically as well as, concentrated. Yeah. So this, he doesn't say it at that point, but, he does tell Phoebe in the second book,
I saw
wow.
this coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. Wow. That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so it's, just turn my volume down there. That's better. Yeah. So that's that's it's been so interesting working through all those sorts of perspectives from different characters, which is just so outside my own experience, and having to put myself into all these various situations and sort of recreate something of it. It's been interesting challenge.
There's something else that really struck me about your books, and I mentioned it in the review, is that Lucy is multiracial, and I've seen that kind of identity, mixed identity, explored in a lot of modern books, but I had never seen it explored in historical fiction, especially something so racially charged as World War II. But that was very interesting to me. She's like a quarter Chinese and quarter Jewish and a quarter white, or half white.
Oh, and even that, it's Hungarian and Scottish.
Yeah.
See, it's interesting, the Australian goldfields in the 1850s, is because you had people come from all parts of Europe and America, as well as British people came to the goldfields, and Chinese came to the goldfields to seek their fortunes, and some stayed on. And so this racial ferment that was there is quite fascinating. And I think it did produce a slightly different outlook to other parts, sort of more isolated parts of the country. So this is where Phoebe is from, is Ballarat, which is the centre of the Australian gold rush of the 1850s, and that's where he's come from. And so it's sort of very different, sort of that more multi-ethnic understanding of people is very much part of him, which transfers to. So it's a little wonder that he felt so comfortable at ease in Austria.
Yeah.
So that was just interesting, and Phoebe herself being that situation in that position, inheriting that, it just came from there. Notwithstanding, there was still Australia was very much a very British. Britain was still home to many Australians in the 1920s, 1930s. Most of the immigration did come from that, but you do have these seeds of other cultural, other cultures present there in small degrees.
And I'm curious about that going forward. Obviously, her Jewish background is going to give her some trouble in your first book. But I'm wondering, I mean, she's Chinese and Japanese, but I'm wondering if that kind of seed of identity will come into play with the Pacific War hate and stuff. She's in Europe, so. But her friends and family are in Australia, so.
Yeah. Well, the Jewish situation is very interesting, and it was the Jewish characters, and I think a lot of problem with fiction is treating Jewish characters as either lambs to the slaughter, or just as a mass, and a mass of people who all think the same, who all behave the same because they're all Jewish, and that's not the case at all. And so it was really important with the Jewish characters in the book to show the various attitudes and the various types of Jewish characters. So you have, sort of the Ukrainian refugees that have come from the latest communist purges, Stalinist purges. You've got the Epstein family who have come from Czechoslovakia and are very consciously Jewish. Well, they're observant Jews, but at the same time they consider themselves as German. They are, they deliberately determined to. The Rose family is different again, where they're wanting to their Jewish aspect is not part of their. They're not observant. They don't go to synagogue or anything like that. They've converted to Christianity to fit in with the social milieu to make it up in society. And so it's a very different approach to it. You've got other characters, yes, who have married and have never their faith has never been important to them. And then you've got Emil, who's that he's very nominally, Jewish, and that's not what he considers himself to be. I mean, as he says, you go far back enough, you'll find enough talents and kippers there, but I'm not like that. That's what it was all about. All religion is hogwash as far as he's concerned. So, just putting that whole spectrum of persons and in that way, so to be able to look at that aspect of the Holocaust in a sort of more detailed, more personable way was important.
I really enjoyed that kind of nuance of identities through like Europe and Australia and all of it. It was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So how's the sequel coming along?
The sequel, well, look, the whole thing's sort of written. The sequel sort of it's the 3 volumes are sketched out. This is a matter of getting details in. So I'm giving myself a bit of a sabbatical at the moment because I've got to concentrate on the publicity regarding the first book, and which it's been good actually having that sort of thing, because I can see the boiler at the back of my brain is going, sort of bubbling away, and all these sort of inspirations come out. Now I know how to write that first chapter in the and it's I've got the characters mapped out, I've got the story mapped out, I've got the thing. It's just getting the detail of the writing, and yes, and the war years and the aftermath, and yes, so that was probably another interesting bit, was the narrative perspective, so working out what angle to tell the story from, and what angle in time was really important. And so having it being told from 1956, 57 was that was interesting. So to be able to say, so for the reader to see that there's this world that we've emerged from, that we're rebuilding, and then fitting the war years into that post-war
I don't think we explained that, but there's a frame story for the historical epic you're writing, and that this is a series of letters that Phoebe is writing to her younger brother to kind of explain their father and where they've come from. And
well, it's one letter, but he's actually in Vienna. He has come to Vienna.
And she's living in Vienna in 1957.
Yeah, and he has come there to study music.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's got this younger brother to deal with, and he's wanting to know the story. Anyway, so they've got this other dimension of the relationship between the two of them, and how this actually, for this, this is really cathartic for Phoebe to have somebody to tell her story to, and it's a way she has of putting all the bits together, and she's actually coming to terms with the whole thing herself, probably yet again in a deeper sense.
Mm-hmm.
And how in life that so often happens, that something will happen to us and we'll rationalise it one way and then we'll rationalise it another way. And it's not until sort of many years afterwards that we're able to really put it in perspective. But then it's another thing to actually communicate it to somebody else and for them to put it into their perspective. And how, you know, there's a huge amount of healing that can be achieved through that.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, and I need to backtrack because I will really read it, but I don't ask you. There's a huge musical influence in both of your books.
yeah.
With your characters being musicians and studying in Vienna and under these famous musicians. Where does that come from?
I'm a musician.
Yeah? What do you play?
I play the piano.
Oh, very nice.
Pianist, but I did learn the cello with a distant prospect, and I did learn the violin for by violence Unavenged, and I love stringed instruments. I think I always wanted. Yes, Ben is saying I'm a cellist. And so look, I love string instruments, love string music, quartets and so forth, and so that it is a way of channeling a particular personal love through it. Then music, where do we start with music? It's just music for the first book was a way of it, you know, the sense that a quartet encapsulates so much about human relationships, about society, that give and take, and that working together to produce something beautiful. That was a sort of an important motif in the second one. The music in the first book. In the second book, music has almost a sardonic element of it. Music becomes a weapon. Music becomes a means, or for Phoebe, music it is a crutch. It is also a weapon. It's a life support system for her. It's her security. It's her, but at the same time, it's her livelihood. At the same time, also it's a means of, well, in the book, it becomes a means of satire, of survival, yes, holding one's place. It's used for very different ends, and you've got it was fun with by Violence Unavenged, using music on all sorts of levels, so songs, through Viennese songs, through Christmas carols, through all sorts of pieces that play, people coming together, orchestral pieces, the way in which music is used. I think when Hubi sees Phoebe and Karem talking in the Saka Cafe, and he tells about the program that he's playing in, well, that's the Vienna, the Philharmonica performing that night, that Phoebe and Karem goes there, and there are all these romantic pieces of music, but he makes all the references to them, and so this real jibe, you know, he's venting his jealousy. So yeah, it is used as a weapon in this book, and becomes more increasingly so as the war, when the war breaks out.
So, what do you do outside of writing? Like, what are you having to balance and juggle in order to produce these master?
I've got 4 kids, happily married, and we're homeschooling, so you can imagine what that involves. So there's all the family stuff, and there's the music stuff, and then there's the writing things, and you know, I do have a lot of plates spinning. And
in a concert hall?
Sorry?
You're a musician. Are you part? I don't know anything about music.
I don't perform. I've got a piano in my living room, and I play that. I'd like to do a lot more of it, but I have to write about it instead. So that's a way of channeling all that sort of that stuff as well. So,
how do you carve out time for your writing? Do you wake up early before the kids are up and write, or
it's usually
you're not allowed into?
It's usually in the afternoons. I tend to look, I'll think about it all the time, and it's amazing how doing the washing and doing the ironing leaves one free to be able to, imagine things. I might be ironing shirts, but I'll be somewhere in Vichy, France, or, somewhere in Vienna or somewhere in another time and place. So there's that side to it. Lots of walks, and you'll be thinking all the time, but the actual physical writing will be done of an afternoon. So once I've done all the other jobs and everything like that, 2 and 4, 2 hours, bang, I write. And then there's the reading that needs to be done, particularly for historical stuff. So that'll be done in between times, and yeah, so I usually have about 3 books on the boil. There's the car book. There's the coffee table book. So the book that I'm reading while I'm waiting for things in the car. There's the book that I'm reading at night time, and there's there'll be one other book around the place, and they'll be read slowly over time. Other books will be read very quickly, but that's usually what happens. And so the writing gets done in very, well, by the end of it, they're very tatty quad-ruled exercise books, which I'll use for scribbling. And I'll just write down all sorts of things, and my battery's running low. And so I'll do that. And then there's the computer writing. And I have the very good fortune to be able to type like the wind. So I type very fast and can get it all down pretty much at the pace I'm thinking, which is great. Getting that battery in, that's good. Yeah, so it's a discipline, and it probably comes from PhD days where you just had to get it done. So you just do it and you focus, and it might be agonizing sometimes, and it is, but somehow the words come together. And as people often say, how do you write a book? You're the mother of 4 kids. How do you manage to write a book? And well, you can't write a book, but you can write a sentence, and it's writing a sentence, another sentence, and another sentence, and another sentence. You just keep on going. And eventually you have a book.
Well, is there a website or any way that readers can follow you?
There is AnnetteYoung.net, yes, and I think also adistantprospect.com. I'm not an avid blogger, but I occasionally put things up. I have a what do I call it? Leech Gathering is my blog. But you find it on the site, and that comes from Wordsworth's poem Resolution and Independence, where the poet is out on the moors, and he's a bit down in the dumps because he's finding it very difficult to get ideas together, and he's feeling the burden of all the great writers before him, and trying to produce a wonderful work of art, and it's getting him down. And then he sees a fellow gathering leeches, and he's picking up one by one, and he's so happy in his occupation, and because he knows it's going to make people better, and but the happiness of this man in this painstaking, pretty yucky sort of job, really sort of just bolsters Wordsworth no end, and he feels much better about himself. And that writing process is a bit like leech gathering. You sort of picking up the leeches of words and putting them all together and doing something good with it. So
that's really cool. Well, thank you so much for calling in and talking with me all the way from Australia. Up early. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's lovely talking
you
to
you. All right. And if you want to keep following Annette Young, you can do so at AnnetteYoung.net or adistantprospect.com. And if you can keep an eye out on Catholic Reads, we'll have reviews of her books coming out. And if you don't have time or the money to support a Catholic artist today, that's okay. You can subscribe to our newsletter and get a weekly book marked off 50% off to free. It's just a nice, easy way to explore new authors and support the art. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you all later.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.